Hello, Culture Matters podcast. I am so excited for this show today. Before I introduce you to our guest, here's a quote just for this episode. The superior physician treats disease before it arises. Huang Di Neijin. Our, hopefully I said that right. Our guest today is someone I had the amazing opportunity to actually meet in a structured environment of learning and growth. And I was immediately struck by their intentionality, thoughtfulness, attention to detail, their passion of what they do and how they show up in the world. It's a great honor to have the founder and CEO of Structured Elements, Doug Bertram, on the show today, who's actually, yes, background in psychology we'll get into, studied traditional Chinese medicine and has been working with patients in and around. I'll let him develop the thought on this, but in and around traditional Chinese medicine and actually getting to the heart of the problem, not just working with symptoms around patients for almost 30 years, and founded this unbelievable organization, Structured Elements. Doug, I'm excited to have you share a little bit about your orthopedic wellness and the whole culture because we haven't yet had any guests in this world on our show. So bear with me here on that. And thanks for coming on the Culture Matters podcast. You got me looking up Chinese philosophers and thinkers, and I want to say one more thing on that the level of uh, intention and thoughtfulness around the philosophy and the methodology. I really respect when I was preparing for this show today, and it showed up when we met in person. So, and at that point, you were just a stranger, a thoughtful stranger at a mastermind. Shout out to Mark Richards' Cool Hollow event. Doug,
Absolutely.
thanks for coming on the Culture Matters podcast.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity, and very similar to yourself. I was very much taken back by your worldliness and how well read you are and your inquisitiveness. And for me, that's all you can ever look for in an individual is openness and curiosity, right? And then the world is your oyster, you know. So I was like, this is a guy I definitely need to follow up with, and let's bounce some ideas around and see if we can give these great listeners something to take away today. And
I
I'll make one little correction. I'm not sure if you nailed the gentleman from your quote correctly, but it's structural elements. So just in case somebody's Googling it, instead of structured, it's structural elements. Yeah, with an L. And yeah, it's very much a passion project for me. 32 years of standing over a table, but have really been developing the project in its current form for about the last 10, 11 years now. So it's been a great blessing to be able to give, this project the attention it has and to be able to impact the lives of all the patients and providers that have gotten to work with.
for the our listeners to go start at the foundation when we're talking in terms of the purpose of structural elements at the root. Um, the customer, what is being solved for the customer? What's at the foundation of this conversation in terms of patients?
Yeah, definitely.
Why do
So
they come in and what
as
are they
you
actually getting?
as you mentioned, my background is I studied Chinese medicine, right? And but the why I studied Chinese medicine is I was already a practitioner of manual therapy. I went to massage school when I was 18, started studying myofascial work right away. Myofascial work is really working at the interface of the muscles and the connective tissues. And but I went to a Buddhist college, and I've always kind of been interested in Eastern philosophy and all of this other things. But ultimately, it was because I love systems. I love systems theory and systems thinking. And Chinese medicine is very much about a system of inclusion of how things fit together versus a system that is breaking things apart and looking at the body as a series of parts, right? So it's really about looking at the connection between things. So I love to look at systems. And with structural elements, everybody says, "Man, are you guys an engineering firm?" When they first, see us, and I say, "Well, we're not, but thank you for that because that's exactly what we're going for." Okay, so structural elements in an engineering context is just that, right? You're looking at compression elements and tension elements and capacity to handle load. And you're really quantifying mechanical stress in a way that can be predictive, right? So I always use the analogy. You're not going to wait until cars fall in the Pacific Ocean to call in the engineer to see if the bridge is strong enough to sustain traffic, right? The
Mm.
engineer's job is to look at predictive models and say, hey, this has the structural integrity to withstand the load that you're asking it to, right? And in the field of orthopedics, it's one field that you would think, it's so important to our overall longevity and our overall health and well-being that we're structurally sound and that we're able-bodied and ambulatory and able to, maintain an active lifestyle. And when that goes away, pretty much everybody I've ever talked to has an experience with, a loved one, or, grandma, grandpa, parent, aunt and uncle, whatever, where once they, fell and hurt their hip or whatever, that was it. That was, then the decline happened and it happened quickly. It's so important to our overall well-being. But it's the one field that we really don't do any true prevention. We don't really look at the body in terms of where could things go wrong in the future if we're not improving the alignment and improving the structures. So we take an engineering approach to quantifying mechanical stress in the body and looking at where there's inefficiencies. So let me just get some language kind of established, a little glossary of terms here so that we can be on the same page for the conversation today. So if you look at the body, everybody talks about, developing a strong core. If you have low back pain, work on your core, strengthen your core. But the idea of a strong core to most people is one of rigidity, is one that can put a wall up, one that can brace against load. And I think that is a misconception of how the body really functions at optimum. So the idea of core is something that I view is a system of integration and the ability to distribute load. Okay. And we're going to talk more about that, the ability to distribute load. And another thing that we're going to talk about a little bit today is capacity. Okay. And load comes in many forms. Okay, so load can be stress, load can be weights that we're lifting, load can be what are we're asked of as family, members. Load can be financial stress. Load doesn't discriminate. Load is just stress in many forms, right? But when we talk about our capacity to handle load, it really comes down to how effectively we can distribute that load. Okay. And so that's what we're really looking at from an engineering perspective is how effectively can that body distribute load to increase its capacity to handle load, right? And there's a bunch of factors that kind of play into the body's ability to do so.
Wow. If I'm the everyday person, I might be thinking we're just talking about acupuncture and you're where you're going, or some kind of surface level aesthetic, like, oh, I feel like I should do this. And if I understand you correctly, you're talking about the body communicating with itself in a way that we can actually handle life in I want to help me follow, a more meaningful, a
Oh,
more
definitely.
productive, or the more thought, like impact all facets of our life.
Oh, absolutely. And the orthopedic inroad is not just our mission is not to get rid of knee pain. Our mission is not to get rid of back pain. our mission is human performance refined. Our mission is to help people increase their capacity to be high performers, right? And that high performance is relative to your goals, right? So my goal isn't to make you into a marathon runner, right? My goal is for Jay to perform at optimum, right? So if that's, if that's making $1 billion, if that's, writing a bestseller, if that's, being the best family man, if that's, having, a physique that'll turn heads at the beach, whatever it is, I'm an enabler, right? So I'm not determining your goals, but what I'm helping people do is perform at their optimal.
Wow. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Wow. Wow. So let's go back, right? You started in psychology. What originally were you trying to understand back then? What was the inspiration then?
So the inspiration then, I had already been trained as a body worker. Okay. So I was already working with the body in a hands-on capacity. And I realized that there's absolutely an interface in that the body stores, right? The body is it takes takes your history and it archives it. Okay. And the thing that fascinates me is that two people that could have the exact same experience, right? And let's keep it tangible here. Two people, are in the same car traveling at the same speed and get into a car accident with the same forces, right? The two of them can have very similar injuries. They both had whiplash injury, the exact same mechanism of impact, the exact same force, everything else. But what somebody takes away from that experience could be completely different. Okay. And the belief systems that we develop around that experience oftentimes determine how well somebody recovers from that event. And that is not purely on a physical level, right? So the interface between psychology and our belief systems and how we create a story and how we archive and create belief systems around an event, to me is equally as important as to what the body physically went through.
When it comes to traditional Chinese medicine, you mentioned earlier about this idea inclusion or integrated. I heard
Yeah,
inclusion and integration, and then what's the opposite of that? And is that can you unpack
separatism,
these?
right? I
Yeah, can
mean,
you
so
unpack this
yeah, so I mean,
philosophically?
Western medicine, looks for a deduction kind of approach, right? Where we deduce in terms of saying, it's this, it's not that, right? And even Western anatomy, right? I mean, it's it requires a scalpel, right? I mean, we're dividing things, right? And in Chinese medicine, it's a system of grouping things together, right? So instead of saying how this structure is separate from this structure, it's really trying to look at how these structures are all related and connected together. And so a lot of times what seems like an unrelated consequence, right, is able to be connected through the language of Chinese medicine and by grouping these things into patterns and into systems. And so let me again keep it tangible. Now you have to remember, man, I grew up in the Midwest, right? So yeah, I grew up in a family of attorneys, right? So for me, when I went out to California and I was studying Chinese medicine, this is like, now wait a minute, like you gotta make this concrete for me. It's like I'm not just gonna take this idea of energy flow and I'm like, but what is it? Like you gotta put it in
Wow.
perspective for me so that I can take it back to my attorney father and explain to him what I'm doing with my life here. But the idea that um, you know, we go to, I'm gonna again keep this very tangible. That we go to a traditional physical therapist in today's insurance-based healthcare system. And now we're there because we had surgery on our shoulder. Okay. And I'm using a real life example from a patient that I saw last week. And they've been in a sling and their neck on the opposite side is really sore from being in the sling. And they told this to their physical therapist. And the physical therapist said, "Oh man, I'm so sorry to hear that. Well, I need you to go back to your primary and get another script so that I can treat the neck." Now they're there for a shoulder injury, and the sling was for the shoulder injury, and their neck is hurting from the sling, from the shoulder injury, but yet those two things need to be treated separately. Okay. So that's an extreme example, obviously, right? But a more common example is somebody sprains an ankle and, 6 weeks later they're experiencing knee or low back pain, and the providers are only able to treat their knee or their low back, but never really bringing it back to the original issue that when they sprained their ankle, introduced a change to their gait, and now they have a little hiccup in their giddy up, and now it's affecting their knee and their low back, right? So again, it's looking at kind of the body as one intelligent system that is
Hmm.
continuously communicating with itself, right? And that doesn't just stop in terms of these gross mechanical patterns of the foot's connected to the ankle, and the ankle's connected to the shin bone, and it's connected to the knee and the hip. And I mean, we can kind of make sense of that. But to take it one step further, it's really about how the body processes information and reacts to that information. And that's a process of integration and regulation. And we're constantly gathering information from the edges. Okay. The connective tissue, our extremities are constantly gathering data and sending it back to the central nervous system. How the central nervous system processes that data and reacts to it determines how useful we can make that data, and how ultimately how well we can integrate it and regulate from it. Okay. And that's the key right there to increasing our capacity to handle load.
So I was when I was watching an interview you did, can you ex elaborate on the chi or the energy? Because when you were talking about how commu on this topic, communication occurs or does not occur at what level within the body.
Yeah, that's the perfect place to take it here. So again, being a Midwest boy, I'm sitting there in class and spending $100,000 on learning energetic medicine, and I'm like, I don't get the chi part. You got to tell me, like, what is it, right? And there, there's all kinds of different types of chi. There's gu chi, which always made me laugh. But the gu chi is the energy that we get from our food. And there's wei chi, which is our defensive mechanism in our immune system. And there's zong chi, and which we get from the air and all this stuff around us. And I'm just like, man, like. But what is it? Like, what is this? It's okay. It's the life force. Okay. But like, what is that, right? And there's some sort of energetic principle there that has to be, a movement of molecules or particles or some sort of, like there has to be something tangible that you can put your hands on. And ultimately, I exchanged the terminology. Instead of talking about chi and energy, I said, what if I call it communication?
Hmm.
Okay. How are we communicating with our outside world? How are we communicating with the food we eat? How are we communicating with the air we breathe? How are we communicating from the information from my feet and what's happening in my hands to what's happening in my brain and in my central nervous system? And as soon as I exchanged the word communication from the word chi or chi flow or energy, all of a sudden, now I started looking at the pathomechanisms of how the body communicates with itself. Okay. And I'm like, now that makes a lot more sense to me, right?
Wow.
And then the idea of blocked chi, right? So in Chinese medicine, they talk a lot about, stagnation and blocked channels and blocked chi. And the purpose of doing acupuncture is to unblock the channels and to increase the chi flow. And I'm like, okay, if there's blocked chi, I'm going to use the term a breakdown in communication. All right. So for some reason, my body is not able to communicate well with itself. So either what it's reporting is, like a bad cell signal, right? Where, oh, I lost you there for a second. There's gaps where it drops off, right? Maybe due to scar tissue, maybe due to inflammation, things like that. Maybe it's real staticky, like, oh, I heard you, but it wasn't very clear, right? So the messages are mixed, maybe because of a pain signal, because of inflammation in the nervous system. So you're getting a lot of pain, and that distorts the ability to communicate the movement and what the tissue needs. So, as we gather this information from the extremities, one of the main mechanisms that we communicate with ourselves is through the connective tissue. And the connective tissue, the fascia, is not just a type of tissue. It is an organ of sensory input. Okay. Not only does it, yes, provide structure, but it provides a lot of feedback and communication through nociception and through feedback to the central nervous system that is extremely important for the body to be able to react and regulate.
I here's an can you elaborate on like this analogy? If I'm driving from point A to point B, I have my own personal values of based on where I want to go. Maybe like let's say I feel under pressure. I have to get to point A to point B very quickly in my car. Then there's stop signs, uh stoplights. That's a part of the social values. Like uh what is that guy? It was Harad's Law or Hamradi. There was I don't know where that comes from. I just lost it. Harad or something like that. Hammurabi came up with the code. So 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 there's social that this part of the stop signs and the stoplights are part of the social values because it's how I'm communicating with other people, strangers.
Mhm.
Because I don't know them. They have their own personal. Now, if the
Sure.
stop sign is down or the traffic light's down, I might go right, I might crash into someone unintentionally.
Yeah,
So I'm just
your
trying to
agenda and their
conceptualize
agendas collide. Yeah.
the body, in a sense, if I understand you correctly, is like this 24/7.
Oh, it's in constant feedback. Yeah, constant. And so let me give you like the big piece of the anatomical physiologic puzzle that is kind of at the mainframe here. So when I talk about a glossary of terms, this idea of core, and we're still going to come back to this concept, but the autonomic nervous system, which regulates our stress response, is two branches, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, right? And it's been, it's a lot more talked about these days than it ever was. But the autonomic nervous system is basically constantly reacting to one pretty primal, basic question is, am I safe? Okay. Am I safe? And if the answer is yes, then we shift into a parasympathetic reaction. If the answer is no, then we go into a sympathetic reaction. And that's basically it's a switch. And when we're in sympathetic, you can expect the physiology to work under one set of laws, and if you're in the parasympathetic, it's going to work under another. And this is not a bad thing at all, right? This is crucial to our survival. So it's really easy to label stress as the bad guy and have, the rest and digest and being chill and relaxed as the good guy. Um, but that's not the case at all. I mean, if you're being chased by a bear, the sympathetic reaction is your best friend, right? It's what's going to keep you alive. Okay. So stress is critical to our survival. It's how we get stronger. It's how we get smarter. It's how we build immune function. Stress is absolutely critical. It's when we don't downregulate from stress that it can become damaging, right? When the regulation becomes impaired. And that's when I like to use the term that load starts to accumulate instead of becoming distributed. And and when load starts to accumulate, I don't care how strong you are, eventually there's going to be fragmentation or breakdown. And so this autonomic nervous system is really key in the conversation because the connective tissue, the fascia, is in constant bidirectional communication with the autonomic nervous system. And so if you are touching something that's hot, if you are, stretching a little too much, it's saying to the nervous system, I'm not safe. And that it prepares you to quickly pull away. It prepares you to stiffen and get ready for impact. It's if the sympathetic is kicked in, the fascia is going to tension. If the fascia is tensioned, it's going to kick in the sympathetic, right? So, I mean, it's both directions. But over time, if we're spending the majority of our time in a protective pattern, we are going to see evidence of that in the history of our fascia, right? So it's going to archive that experience. So again, if we take it back to the experience of the two people in the car hitting the same, impact, the exact same whiplash that both of them got, but one of them continues to tell the story that I'm not safe, right? And maybe they never resolved it on a physical level, maybe they never resolved it on a neuroprocessing level, or maybe they never resolved it on a psychological level of developing a new belief system. So they continue to, every time something approaches from the right side, they continue to get a sympathetic response and they tighten up their tissue. But maybe all that was happening is somebody, approaching a stop sign with full intention to stop. But if that's what their experience is, every time they drive to work, every time they drive to the grocery store, they already have placed so much load on themselves just in getting to work, let alone all the stress and everything that's being asked of them once they're at work, right? Now the other individual that was in the accident, right? Maybe they did some work to really repattern, and they developed a conscious override that said that's just a car approaching a stop sign. It is not the same event as when I got into the car accident, and they can notice that they are getting that belief system activated, and they can say, I'm not in danger, I am safe. And they can take a deep breath and they can switch themselves into the parasympathetic system and they can regulate. And because they're regulating, they're distributing load. And by the time they get to work, they're fresh, right? They're not now carrying all of these triggers that happened in transit, and they're starting at a much greater capacity to start their workday, right? But all that was a difference of belief system and repatterning, right? From how they reacted to the same event as individual A.
And are you making the claim that the physical, how our listeners, um, how proactive we are with with our physical, because it's a component of this holistic
It is.
system
So
of our body, of our psychology, of who we are. That I want to, and
what
I, yeah,
what
this
I'm
is deeply
saying
impacting me on a personal level right now,
what
actually.
I'm saying is that we are integrated systems, okay? And that system is dependent on, I love the term, not mind-body connection, but I love the term the body mind. Okay. And there is no separation. Okay. And it's we process information from the edges and we integrate it at the core. And that is absolutely a fusion of information and it's happening at real time all the time. And so the idea that our psychology is somehow separate from our physiology and that somehow separate from our musculoskeletal, resilience and health. I mean, it is all deeply, deeply connected in all moments. And our belief systems can impact the health and elasticity and functionality of our soft tissues, and our soft tissues can affect our belief system, right? And it's intertwined. And so this this path kind of started of, you asked me the question of why I wanted to study psychology, right? And having been a body worker, I'm saying that, just me working on the tissue is without me having language to understand, how somebody creates and maintains these belief systems. I'm only getting part of the puzzle, right? And then the type of Chinese medicine that I studied, it put it together even further by really looking at the interface of where all that stuff kind of matters in terms of how it impacts our health and well-being.
I want I this is on Sept so I didn't put two and two together till now, but I have been saying to myself, I'd like your advice on this, or maybe some thoughts, or just an ear. Uh, I've been saying for some time. So on September 22nd, 2017, I was in a ATV side by side crash, and my right arm was crushed under this ATV, and I had no use of it was the prognosis was that I would never use my arm again, and I mean, it was pretty much a defining moment. And I've said many times on the podcast, uh, I've thought about it, that ultimately I'm still who I am, who I've been. Part of the reason I went to that gathering that we met at, actually, I've been trying to almost like Humpty Dumpty get parts of who I was then, that it's almost like they were that parts of who I was then was shattered
Mhm.
with that accident. Now other values have come about from taking like I went from unbelievably extroverted to an asymmetrical existence of that guy.
Yeah,
And
I mean,
so are you making a claim, without knowing my story at all, like
yeah.
that these are connected events? That I've noticed myself walking in the beginning when I couldn't move I had no hand, my posture, much of this is on YouTube, like when I used to do videos. Um, it's just now my starting to stand up straight. Dr. Peterson says stand up straight with your shoulders back. Rule one in book two, 12 rules for life. But for the longest time after that incident, that experience, I'm walking like you know, I'm not doing that whatsoever. So do you think they're
So
connected?
posture is not the it is the product of of strategy, right? So it is, posture tells the story, right? So it's we we posture according to the best strategy that we have at the time, right? So it's not that bad posture or poor posture or a slumped posture is um it tells the story. It's the most effective thing that we have to work with at the time, right? Until we learn and develop skills to regulate and integrate more effectively. And what I'm saying is, like, getting back to this language is how we do that is we increase our capacity to handle load. And we increase our capacity to handle load through somatic literacy, through learning how these things are related. What does the information from that extremity, what is it trying to tell me? Okay. And as I understand it and I listen to it, and I can process that information without reliving the trauma or thinking that, if I extend my arm, that it's going to get crushed again, right? There's a whole healing has to happen on a lot of levels, man. It's not just the bones need to, remend and you need to lay down, new collagen and strengthen the bone. And it's not just that you need to then lengthen the muscle, and it's not just that you need to then, regenerate the nerves. It's that you need to reestablish the communication with that part of your body so that anytime you get signal from that part of the body, it's not triggering an accumulation of load. It's not triggering that sympathetic, system again that the body is feeling like, hey, I'm getting information from my right arm. I must not be safe. It's a reprogramming that has to happen, and that reprogramming happens through integration on multiple levels. Yes, you need the tissue to heal. Yes, you need the nerves to come back online, but you also need for the integration to be able to integrate that movement back with the rest of your body. And a lot of times with an injury like that, I mean, I have a similar story. When I was 14, I broke my wrist. And I was the starting goalkeeper on my high school soccer team, and the doctor, same thing. He was like, don't expect a lot of use out of that hand. I was like, I'm 14. I live to play soccer, and like, what do you
Wow.
mean don't expect a lot of use out of that hand? And the therapist that I went to, he's like, listen, man, he's like, you know, the doctor, played a very important role here in getting, your hand, screwed back together and getting these bones, mended. And there was a lot of swelling, there was a lot of nerve compression, so I understand where he's coming from there. But hey, I wouldn't do what I do if it weren't for the body's amazing capacity to heal. He said it's not going to be easy and it's not going to be comfortable, but if we do the right things, the body is resilient, and it will come back, and I was starting goalkeeper my sophomore year, right? So so for me, it was like the story there was that hey, like if you believe I'm done, never again, right? Likely that's going to be the outcome, right? If you believe it's going to be tough, right? And it's going to be hard work and it's going to be painful, but with that, anything is possible. It produces a lot more resiliency, So, um, I'm gonna introduce like one other thing to the conversation here, just to take it up, another 10,000 feet, just so that we can really talk about the context of, what are we dealing with here, right? So I take it even one step further that the idea of balance through avoidance, okay, that the idea that we're gonna stay balanced by not doing things that could get us hurt, right? By not eating things that aren't perfectly healthy for us. The strategy of avoidance. I'm not going to go out in the cold because I might catch a cold. I'm not going to, run because I might trip and fall. The strategy of avoidance, it works for a certain level of demand, but it ultimately creates fragility. If we avoid stress, if we avoid the extremes. Now, I'm not telling everybody to go, jump off of cliffs and jump out of airplanes and you know, go into extreme, climates and all those things. Although I've lived a lot of my life doing those things and have a lot of people in my life that's, how they spend their time. But ultimately, we need to develop not a strategy of avoidance, right? And that's kind of like the idea of the middle path, right? Is that we're avoiding the extremes and therefore we're living a balanced life. But instead of a strategy of avoidance, a strategy of that develops better integration and is able to take the information, process the information, teach us how to regulate. Now we can take that information and we can develop resilience. Okay. And that is what the opportunity of a trauma, the opportunity of an injury presents. You can say, all right, this happened. There's a tremendous opportunity to learn about the human spirit, to learn somatic literacy, to learn how this injury has changed, you know, how I think about myself, how I breathe, how I move, and if you throw yourself into the curiosity and into the experiment, you can come out with so much more information about how your body moves and processes and integrates and regulates that you can come out stronger at the other side. right? And that is the beauty of our physiology, is that the stress and the setbacks are opportunities to gain increased capacity, and
Mm.
there's a lot of people out there who, people like, even I'll just use myself as an example. People always ask me, how do you do all that you do? Because I'm a real hands-on father. I get up, I make my girls, lunch every day. I like to, drive them to their activities. I'm the CEO of a franchise company. I still have the busiest practice in the whole company of how many patients I see. I handle
Wow.
our marketing. I do our capital raises, and then I like to do things like, run marathons and 50-mile races. And, I just finished the first book in a 3-book series that I'm writing.
Wow.
I love to cook, and it's like, okay, like that's a lot of stuff, right? How do you do all that's on your plate, right? I've developed the capacity, right? I've done a lot of hard shit in my life, right? And I take stuff at face value for the most part. Not that I always, I'm very human in this, but the language that I use is that I don't project more than what is being asked of me in the situation. Okay. And let me elaborate on that a little bit. So somebody calls in sick, or let's say even worse than that, somebody calls in, they quit, right? And it leaves us with an opening where we don't have patients that have coverage, or we don't have somebody to cover the desk. At one point in my life, because I had so many different things going on, that would have sent me into an absolute tailspin. It wouldn't have been that you know, that this wasn't a good fit for them, or that they, got sick or whatever it was. It was that they're trying to kill me. Okay. And how they're trying to kill me is they're going to ruin my business, which is going to mean that I'm going to go bankrupt, which means that my wife is going to leave me, which means that I'm never going to see my kids. The stress of that is going to be intolerable, and that's going to give me a heart attack, and it's going to kill me. Right. So something as benign as somebody else has nothing to do with me, has just a consequential thing in their life come up. It was me creating the story that that's a threat to my survival. Okay. And that belief story that I would tell myself came from the accumulation of a lot of injuries. It came from the accumulation of really getting, in deep with business, and taking on a bunch of debt, with having, illness with family members, with having just, COVID was a big one, right? And it wasn't until, really almost having like I had like a hypertensive event where, like, where literally I, like, a lot of people, I mean, I was still very healthy in that I ran a lot and everything else, but it almost put me over the top. I mean, most people would have stroked out, and it was just like I let it accumulate, you know, and I didn't stop doing any of it. Okay. I didn't go to the mountains and leave my family and put on robes. I didn't stop seeing as many patients. I didn't, work any less. If anything, I'm working more hours. I'm working out more. I'm doing more for my family. It's quite the opposite. What changed is I stopped letting myself indulge in the story that everything that happened was that I was the victim, that it was being done to me, that it was to ultimately to try to get me, and to try to ruin me, right? That was all me doing that. Okay. And as soon as I kind of called myself out on it, and I was like, you're doing this to yourself, right? You
Yeah.
have every opportunity to rewrite the narrative, right? And as I started rewriting the narrative and saying, that's not a threat to me, that's just, they had something, come up, their spouse took another job in Texas. Of course they have to leave, right? They're not doing that to me, right? And we'll be fine. We've always found replacements, right? This is a great place to work. And if I can take that moment right? And instead of letting it trigger this whole spiral of anxiety and throwing me into this sympathetic drive, and I can just take a breath, I can recognize what's happening, I can reroute the energy and distribute the load back through my nervous system, relax my connective tissue, connect to my breath, and say, this too shall pass, right? Now, I'm right back to centered. I'm right back to productive. Okay. So now I'm not stewing on this, taking me away from everything. But that fragmentation, when you allow something to trigger you and take you off center, that fragmentation now allows you to no longer distribute the load, but you now start to accumulate load. So now the kids are they're even not even fighting. The kids are playing and they're loud, right? And you're like, like knock it off. I'm trying to think, and then somebody bugs you on your phone. Ah, just another thing I have to deal with, and then you get this bill that you forgot, like you haven't paid, and it's just like all of a sudden everything starts to accumulate, load starts to accumulate, and then it becomes too much. And when that load accumulates, that's when you get sick. That's when you get injured. That's when you react with violence or with words that are now between you and a loved one. Um, and that's where the damage is done, right? So nothing changed. I didn't you know from the outside, my calendar looks the exact same as it always has, right? But the shift was literally in my own awareness of how I was processing experience. And by shifting that on that level, right, I became a better regulator and I increased my capacity to add even more to my plate with less stress, right? With less toxicity from the stress, right? Because it
Mm.
wasn't accumulating.
What you shared earlier about the different types of the different energy, food, environment, events, these elements put us in a reactive, or our body, they break down communication essentially.
Well, it's all stuff that we have to process, right? So, everything you put in your body has to be processed, right? And so, a lot of people like as a short-term solution, people will eat things that feel good and taste good because of the dopamine hit and the good feelings that come along with those pleasurable sensations, right? And sometimes it's a reaction to having let their glycemic index or their blood sugars get low, so they get this little pickup of energy by eating quick conversion foods, things like that. But then the cycle has the opposite effect because now, they've overeaten or they've eaten things that have low value, and now the body has to deal with it. It doesn't go away, like you've stopped enjoying it, right? But it still has to be processed and eliminated. Okay. And that requires regulation, right? That requires, the body to have to balance out whatever you did to your blood sugars. It requires that the body has to somehow break this down and eliminate it. That's all load, right? That's all things that the body now has to deal with.
What are some early signs of um, our listeners can take away of signals when that they should pay attention to that could signal to them that their system is overloaded?
Clenching the jaw is a major one. Okay, fight or flight. We're hardwired to bite or run. Okay, so we are jaw clenchers and we are hip clenchers. Okay, and both of those areas are neurologically hardwired to react to stress. So if you're clenching your jaw, you're probably in a stressed state. If you are breathing shallow, you are in a sympathetic state. If you routinely suffer from poor digestion and gas and bloating and digestive irregularity, you're probably spending a lot of time in a stressed state. Because when you're in a sympathetic state, your bowels, your peristalsis shuts down. Because you have to realize, man, you're trying to protect survival functions when you're in a sympathetic state, right? Everything else can wait. right? You can get blood out to the extremities, later. Right now we need all that in the core, to deal with this threat, But when we're in that state too often, we're not getting the rest of our physiology to be optimized so that we can get good circulation out and repair that tissue that got damaged in the foot, right? We're not, saying, all right, it's time to break down that steak and make use of it, right? And feed our tissue and everything else and eliminate it. We shut that process down, and then therefore it sits, and that causes discomfort and gas and bloating and dysregulation.
Mm.
So it's certainly accumulation of physical tension in the neck and shoulders, right? That means that we're holding ourselves in a holding pattern, right? Versus being able to distribute that load throughout our spine and throughout our system, So these are all, there's a bunch of other signs. Cold hands and feet, another one. If people constantly are noticing that their hands and their feet get cold, that means that they're not getting good circulation out there, which is a product of being in a state of sympathetic drive. But the beauty is that when we become aware of that, right, then we can use simple tools to shift out of it, right? So breathing is one of the easiest, most accessible tools that we have to challenge these patterns. If we exhale slightly longer than we inhale, we will eventually trigger parasympathetic breakthrough. The vagus nerve is stimulated upon exhalation. And so if we take in, a 4 second inhale and we exhale for 6 or 7 seconds, okay, we are going to start seeing some parasympathetic breakthrough. There's a metric on if you wear an Apple Watch or if you use some of the wearables that's accessible that most people don't know about. If you look at the health app on your phone and you have a wearable that's collecting data like an Apple Watch or an Oura Ring, there's a metric called HRV, which is heart rate variation. And ultimately, this is measuring the speed of our heart rate and how much the speed of our heart rate changes between our inhale and our exhale. And so if the speed of our heart is identical at inhale and exhale, you would have a value of zero, right? That there's no variation. And the bigger that number is, right? If you get a number like, a real great number would be something, like 70, 80, 100, right? If you get numbers up there, it means that you're getting a huge amount of variation between your inhalation and your exhalation. That would indicate that you're getting really good parasympathetic breakthrough, right? That as you're breathing, that exhale is actually triggering a slowing down of the heart. And that is seen as a healthy thing. Okay. If that
Wow.
number is chronically low, right, it means that you spend a lot of time in a sympathetic state where you're not getting that down regulation in real time with your exhalations. So that's a metric that you can pay attention to that you can kind of experiment with if you start playing with some of these things to see if they're making a quantifiable difference. I love data, right? As I mentioned, we see ourselves as engineers, right? So, the more that we can quantify and the more that we can measure, I think is a wonderful thing. I don't want it to be a faith-based medicine. It's like let's measure these changes and let's see if we're making a difference.
I'm curious when you made the shift or evolution in your career towards mastery here, um, in the profession from patients to a methodology. Because I want to go into there's clearly methodology, philosophy, and also now a structural actual value proposition for practitioners in the world.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I'd love to first understand when that evolution started from patient to methodology.
Definitely. Yeah. So structural elements is a proprietary approach to treatment. Okay, so that I've developed and have evolved over a lot of years. And Structural Elements is also the name of an orthopedic wellness franchise company, right? So you can buy a Structural Elements clinic, right? We sell franchises. You can also become a Structural Elements provider, right? And we call the providers in our clinics micro franchisees. They've actually bought into the system where they receive support and training and ultimately we're solving for something that is really critical. And in order to practice in the way that I'm promoting, that we are looking at the body as an intelligent system, and we are treating the body systemically, not treating a part at a time. Um, that pretty much only can happen outside of the constraints of the insurance world, right? Because you're not getting reimbursed if like my example earlier, if I start treating the neck for a shoulder diagnosis code, I'm likely not going to get reimbursed. Certainly, if you're coming to me with headaches and I'm saying that the problem is your unresolved ankle sprain, I'm not getting reimbursed. Now, providers have a very difficult decision to make. They can understand that, but in order for them to change the paradigm of which they're working, they, in many cases, have to leave a paycheck, right? And then they have to go and start from zero or below zero. They have to invest money to develop their own brand, their own clinic, their own environment. Um, this is expensive, right? I mean, doing a build out on a clinic and creating a logo and having somebody build your website and build your brand and all your print materials and you're going to be pretty deep into it before you even get back to zero just to see your first patient. But then income replacement on top of that those added expenses, you've got a steep hill to climb. And there's definitely an improvement of lifestyle, and there's definitely an improvement of your joy of what you do if you're able to offer more comprehensive care and to provide what you believe to be a better standard of care to your patients. That definitely has an offset to the financial challenge and but if you're cleaning the bathrooms on the weekends and you're doing all your marketing and you're doing events and you're managing personnel and all of that. You've ultimately traded one headache for another, right? And so for us, we believe that there should be a better option for people that want to focus on quality patient care. And a shared cost environment is how we've solved for that. So our clinics are shared cost. People rent turnkey ready space and we do all of the lift, right? So um, they walk into a beautiful clinic that's already built out. They rent the rooms and this amount of space that they need. They're already staffed. They have desks to handle, the bookings and the collection of fees. They, have clean rooms that are fully supplied when they arrive. And the idea of separating the back end kind of business mechanics from the delivery of care is solely for the purpose of allowing that provider to operate at the top of their scope and give them the autonomy to be solely focused on patient care so that there's no distractions. And that patient, they vote with their dollar, right? They're gonna open up their wallet and swipe their card because they're getting results and they have an ally who is solely focused on helping them achieve their goals. And so Structural Elements as a company is designed to give patients access to providers that are solely focused on helping them achieve greatness. Okay. And the business mechanics are all there to support that. The modality and methodology of Structural Elements, and this is where I first started was I had a group of students. I was going to school in California, started in San Diego, great academic program, and but then when we got to the clinical portion of the studies, um, I wanted to be a little bit more integrative between Eastern and Western medicine. And there's a school in Santa Cruz, California, that I thought had a stronger clinical program in terms of how they integrated Eastern and Western, medical care. So I transferred to go up there. And I'd had a busy massage practice in San Diego, sold that practice when I left, got to Santa Cruz, and was able to build a thriving massage practice in Santa Cruz in a very short amount of time. And as I, you know, kind of started to get to know other students who, weren't transfer students, but had been there for, some time. A lot of them were also massage therapists who, were trying to build practices while they put themselves through school. And a lot of them really struggled to do so. And so a group of students approached me, kind of like, dude, like, you just moved here and like you're crushing it, right? We've been here for years. And like are really struggling to get traction. Like, can you teach us like what is it that you're doing differently? And so I really thought about it, because it wasn't like I was like some, wizard at marketing. This is kind of pre-social media or meaningful social media anyways. I didn't have any marketing budget. I wasn't out there, doing a bunch of ad spend and billboards and all of this stuff. It wasn't it at all. But my patient retention was near 100%. When
Wow.
somebody came to see me, they kept coming to see me, So, patient retention, even today in our clinics, patient retention is 92 to 94%. It is why we're successful is because we never graduate a patient, right? And the reason is that when somebody would come to me, and what I realized was that the absolute fundamental difference of how I approached it is when somebody would come to one of these other therapists and they would say, how's everything doing? Anything bugging you? And they would say, yeah, my back, has been hurting me. I deal with a lot of back pain. And their focus was getting rid of their back pain. My focus has never been getting rid of the back pain. Do I want people to live pain-free? Absolutely, right? I'm not saying that I want them to continue to have back pain. But the very first thing that I establish with every patient is, okay, you have this back pain. What would you be doing differently if you didn't have this back pain? Right? Well, I'd love to get back to running. Great. Let's focus on getting you back to running. Okay. The back pain just went away somewhere mid-process,
Huh.
right? But the goal is never getting rid of the pain. The pain is just there to communicate where you're not distributing load effectively. Okay. My goal is getting you to performing at your optimum. And so, we call it human performance refined, right? I want to help you be the best version of yourself. And that I'm not going to place the ceiling on that for you, right? So there's always more that you can be doing. And we have the fundamental capability and the philosophy to continue to support people in that pursuit. And so the language is very important. So establishing an active goal, not just one of avoidance, but one of resilience and helping somebody become a master regulator and a master integrator.
But I have a lot of questions. Go ahead. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
no, no, definitely. And then I'll just real quick, the other thing that is unique and different about the approach is that we've mapped out in the body where something called focal adhesions form systemically throughout the connective tissue. And these are the communication interrupters, right? They are the ones that are when compensation starts to happen and this change in the connective tissue starts to occur. That's when the communication between the connective tissue and the autonomic nervous system becomes suboptimal. And so as we help to identify those and release them is when we can help optimize that communication between the nervous system and the connective tissue. And every provider in our system whether it's a doc doing injections, whether it's a nurse doing IVs, whether it's a Pilates instructor doing Pilates, whether it's a massage therapist, an acupuncture, a chiropractor, everybody learns that language, right? And that is kind of the systemization of the approach.
Well, first, anecdotally, I'd like to say that I would, me personally, would love to have an advisor of that capacity focus on the goal or the outcome, not just whatever I think the problem is. So if it's not you because you have an international society of professors, essentially, right? Teachers, doer, practitioners, I would love to know where there was one that had this that was certified or had that credibility.
Good.
Because who the that sounds like an amazing proposition, and
Yeah.
yeah, if I don't need to work with the founder of Harvard, but if maybe one of the professors that knows ABC, yeah, I trust the brand. So I want to say that I'm excited about what you're doing and what you're accomplishing. One thing I was curious about, is it fair to say that the franchising uh was is more of a container or a way to protect your philosophy as so as to not just scale for scale's sake? Is
Def
that
Definitely. I mean,
curious about
the,
that?
so yeah, the franchise, I mean, I stumbled upon franchise as a model. I really did. I was looking for intellectual property protection, and was at a point where I was, trying to think about how we're going to scale up the educational, component of structural elements. But one of the things that's very difficult is the nature of continuing education in medicine is people need so many continuing education credits, every so often, or CMEs, and then once they have them, they get busy in their practices, and so it's really hard to develop kind of a consistency of working with people over time. It's very transient. You get people that show up, weekend workshop, they fulfill their requirements, you may never see them again. And I didn't want people running around saying that they were doing structural elements when that's my only touch point with them, right? I felt like that would water the
Wow.
brand down and
Wow.
ultimately would not set up therapists to benefit from, as much as I knew that I could help them become master, providers. So franchise gave me a bunch of things. One is it gave me ongoing access to these providers, right? So I'm not just teaching them a set of techniques, hand techniques, and then sending them on their way. It's a mentorship throughout their career. And it's not just a mentorship as to what to do in the treatment room, but it's mentorship on, come on, man, show up on time, right? So that you're not rushed. Show up in enough time that you can actually sit for a moment and actually kind of take inventory of yourself before you're putting yourself responsible for somebody else's care. It's like, make sure that you're getting work done too, so that you're not letting load accumulate, and that you can actually share the experience with somebody of what being in a relatively balanced, effectively regulated body, feels like and looks like. It's a cultural piece, right? I know you're the culture man, right? And culture does matter, right? Big time. And it's like, with the franchise, we can actually create a culture where providers are not kind of siloed in their own techniques, their own thoughts, their own way of doing things, but that we can kind of learn from one another, we can encourage one another, we can care for one another. If somebody gets hurt, injured, ill, whatever, we can step up and cover for them so that they don't have their patients go somewhere else. I mean, it's really a support system is what it
Mm.
is. And so the idea of franchise, it really is just about having somebody buy into something that both supports them and that they can have for themselves. It's really it works in both directions. It's we're here to support them, and they're here to, to focus on patient care and create a community that makes showing up to work, that much more wonderful,
Let's talk about providers and the professionals for a moment here. What does it look like a path of someone they're newer to the industry? Is that a path possible for them as
Yeah,
well as
definitely.
what it looks like for those that have been in
We get
operating
both.
for
We
some
get
time?
both. And there's advantages and disadvantages to both as well, right? Somebody who's a little bit greener in their career, they might, have less experiencing and managing, patients, and therefore they might need a little bit more hand holding to really kind of get confidence is the word that I would use more than anything. But also they haven't developed a lot of bad habits either. So sometimes providers that are kind of set in their ways, they're a little bit harder to adopt, new input, right? And so maybe they're a little bit more resistant at first, to learning from somebody else's experience. I heard at one of my first franchise conferences, somebody said that franchise is the business of selling your mistakes. Right. And I just love that, right? It's like, why would somebody invest in a system and then not learn from and take advantage of the wisdom of the system and the years of experience that predicated, the way that things are functioning. Like I said, 32 years of standing over a table, and it's not just that I've stood over a table for 32 years, but I've educated countless therapists, and my philosophy in education is I have just as much to learn. It's always a communication, right? So I've gotten exposure to how other people do things. I've worked in numerous environments, and I'm always like, I'm lazy, man. Like if there's a better way to do something, please show me. I'll adopt it. I'm not rigid in my ways at all. I constantly learning new things from all of the therapists that have come in and out of the system. Um, so, people can definitely, we don't credential anybody. You have to be licensed, right? You have to have gone to, again, massage school, athletic trainer, be an athletic trainer, be a chiropractor, be a physical therapist, be a licensed acupuncturist, a nurse, a physician's assistant. You have to have your credentialing, in order to plug in, but then we can teach you how to view the body through a different lens, and we can help our providers develop a common language so that we're all able to speak to each other about some of the observations that we make about the body when we're approaching it from this systems approach.
What values of providers that are ideal, their values that are not being met, that structural elements really solves for and with them?
Well, again, a lot of it is the burnout that happens from the insurance, world. And believe me, our medical system is world class in terms of saving lives. It is. It absolutely is. But when we come to proactive preventative care, we have big gaps, and a lot of those gaps are because of the insurance model. They just are. They really limit. When you go to a doctor and they tell you that you should be on a prescription, and then the insurance says, no, we're not paying for that prescription. We'll give you, the generic, right? Or you need an MRI. And they say, no, you can't have an MRI. You need to go to physical therapy. In my opinion, that's the practice of medicine, by unlicensed individuals. If you're determining the plan of care based on reimbursement, right? And certainly in musculoskeletal medicine, it's very much, knee hurts. You can do things for the knee, but you can't look at the hips, you can't look at balancing the posture, you can't look at retraining the gait, you can't, think too big picture. And so, um, also in a lot of these environments, they are, corporately owned, and there's a lot of financial pressure to maximize billable units. So the amount of time that providers have with patients is increasingly being squeezed, and the amount of documentation that needs to happen in that time continues to increase. All the while that reimbursement rates are being negotiated down and down and down, right? So it becomes a high volume game is really the only way that it can be lucrative, So there oftentimes is a lot of pressure from management for these providers to, really turn and burn. And it's not that they're, not loving, empathetic, compassionate providers, but a lot of times some of the burnout is that they don't feel like they can be effective in the environment that they're in because of some of those constraints. And that would wear on
Wow.
just about anybody. Nobody wants to be, half as effective as they feel like they could be under other circumstances.
Well, it makes me think of that, what you said about changing the story. When you decided to change the story, all this energy came about. What a profound, what's, what's the line you're unwilling to cross? Let's say, even if it, gro growth demands it from a core value standpoint or a sh structural
Yeah, I
specific.
mean, look, I mean, I'm a realist, right? I'm a realist, and if I am successful in growing the company in the direction that I will be faced at some point with how do I exit, right? And how do I, hand this off and maintain integrity? And so to me, that is only possible with robust systems, right? And so we have invested heavily in our operations manual and our pre-opening guides and our quality assurance reviews and we've archived our trainings so that, they live beyond me. I've built legacy into the way that we've set the company up structurally. We've also maintained a separate entity that provides the education and owns the IP. So even if we handed off the ability to sell franchises and to help them get the doors open, we still have a path to being involved in the education and the mentorship as an education company. So I've been very thoughtful about protecting, and again, why did I get into franchise in the beginning? It was all about protecting the integrity of the brand and trying to put the control measures in there to make sure that the brand had standards that were continued to, be met as we scaled.
How do you see this work that you do and all the providers that work with you and will in the future impact our society today?
So here's the deal. If we scale through promoting the importance of self-regulation, right? Which is teaching people how to do this on their own, right? Which reduces dependency on medications, which keeps people well, which, keeps people away from diabetes medication and dialysis and, all of the very profitable, aspects of medicine that, I mean, sick people are very profitable for our medical system. It's just true. If we scale through helping educate people to be more effective, more again, somatically literate, to be able to recognize when they're stressed and to be able to rewrite the script to help them de-escalate that stress and down-regulate when it's time to down-regulate. And we can keep people orthopedically healthy so that they can tolerate more activity and they can be better movers and they can be in less pain and they can be out there enjoying physical activity and time with their kids and engaging in the activities that they're passionate about, be it running, be it golf, be it skiing, whatever it might be. I think we're just going to live in a happier society. I mean, that is a place that I want to live, and our younger patients that are coming to us have a much higher value proposition than what we saw with the generations before them. A lot of people, it was like, it's just grind, 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 tough it out, no pain, no gain. You get out of it what you put into it. But a lot of our younger, Gen Zers and stuff are saying, I don't want a knee replacement when I'm older, right? I don't want to, go through metabolic syndromes and have to gain a bunch of weight before I realize that I need to lose a bunch of weight to get healthy. Like they really are very committed to prevention, right? And taking better
The
care of
new,
themselves.
younger generations.
Yes, 100% they are. And so there's an unmet niche in our healthcare system of how do we work with the motivated people who want to stay ahead of it
Wow.
and to develop a skill set that will allow them to, again, deal with the demands of modern life, which is a tremendous amount of load coming
Could
at
there
you.
be a scenario in the future if the younger generations are becoming more proactive and think about their future in that way, where could there be a demand where there's more demand than there are qualified practitioners,
I
providers?
think I think that's already the case. I mean, a lot of people will say, okay, like I really want to start taking better care of myself. I want to go work with like a functional medicine, doctor and really like, look at my labs and all of that. Who should I go see? And I'm like, well, here's the deal. I can tell you five good people, but none of them are taking new patients because they're
Wow.
all slammed, right? So there really does become a bottleneck in terms of the demand for people that want providers who are truly patient-centric and thinking about these things on the front end. There's definitely an availability issue. There's more demand than there are providers offering this style of care.
If you were to bottle it down, the the value proposition to patients, or like what's a core principle that makes your work work and the work that your providers provide, the fulcrum, to the culture.
Yeah, I mean the fulcrum to me is that that there's a relationship that gets formed where when somebody is paying for their service out of pocket, there's a buy-in that also is very different than the entitled like I deserve this care because I pay my insurance premiums. There's a little different buy-in when somebody invests in their care directly. And there's also a responsibility from the provider that that person, they're not going to keep swiping their card if they're not feeling the value of this service, right? So I've got like one shot to convince them that this is money well spent, right? And because people are very critical. I mean, everything's expensive now, and and increasingly so. So we're very much having to fight for where that disposable income or where that the value gets placed on where people are spending their money. And so you would think that that means that, we only work with, upper middle class, people, with a high net worth. But it couldn't be farther from the truth. A lot of people that, are uninsured that come to see us, right? A lot of people make a living with their bodies, with manual labor, right? And
Wow.
all of a sudden, it's like, yeah, maybe, paying, a couple $100 for, musculoskeletal service seems like a lot of money. But if it gets you back on the job and you're not missing work, for those guys, it's critical, right? Or work with a lot of hairdressers, same thing. They're on their feet all the time. They're working with their arms up, and their necks and their backs. That their longevity in their career is going to be short if they don't take care of themselves. So we have a lot of people that it's not that they have a lot of money to be able to afford care. It's that they have prioritized it. Maybe they're getting a few less, pumpkin spice lattes a week, but they've decided that this is critical to, to their health and well-being, and it's something that they prioritize in financially.
Last question, Doug. Is there anything that we didn't cover today that you really want our listeners or whomever will listen to this to just take away from this conversation about your mission and your vision?
Yeah, I want to go back to just recapping just a little bit the huge pivot that happened in my life. Okay. And the huge pivot, I had already been to Chinese medical school. I could tell you just about everything there is to know about the physiology of the body, right? I studied Eastern philosophy, so I could talk with you all day long about the principles of meditation and how important meditation is, okay? I was an endurance athlete. I'd already been, able to run 100-mile races and, and physically, looked in good shape. Okay. But the pivot for me was really about the narrative of whether I was processing something as a threat or whether I was processing it as information that needed to be integrated.
Hmm.
Okay. And as somebody with a tremendous amount of knowledge of the body, it's not, you don't need to go and watch YouTube videos and Instagram videos about what you should be doing with kettlebells differently than what you're doing with kettlebells now. It's not about hip openers. It's not about, the perfect amount of protein in your diet. Okay. It is about developing somatic literacy and being able to recognize when you're in a stress response and whether that stress response is appropriate to the demand of the situation. Okay. And sometimes it is, right? You're driving on the highway in a snowstorm. Yes, you should be in a stress state in order to have all of your senses on high alert. Okay. But when you get home, you need to realize that you're off the highway and you need to find ways to relax through awareness, not through extrinsic means. And if you develop that awareness of when you're in a stress response and develop the very simple tools to help you downregulate, your capacity will go through the roof to handle the load that life is placing on you. It is not through avoidance, it's through integration and regulation.
Thank you so much, Con, on this episode. I hope we do this again, and you're welcome back anytime. If our listeners want to connect with you, what's one place that you recommend them go to get involved in your mission?
Yeah, I mean, the company website is the hub of the wheel that spurs you into all other spaces. So structuralelements.com is our main page, and you can find all of our social spaces from there. And you can contact us through the website, and that comes directly to me still. So I'm very active in our inbox. And there's lots of good information there, both about, being a patient if there's a clinic in your area, or being a provider if that's a desire, or opening a franchise. I mean, those are kind of, all three of those things are addressed via our main page.
Doug Bertram, thank you so much for coming on the Culture Matters podcast. This has been a pretty inspiring episode. If you're listening to this episode, please share this with someone that you believe will resonate with this conversation. Leave us a review on the Culture Matters podcast, and we will see you next time. Thank you, my friend.